Might use this one because we're going to share. Yes? Okay. We're going to do it this way then, because there's the two of us and we only have one headset, so it's either this or a natural level. All right. Well, welcome from our side to this BOF session on Spring. This is meant to be a BOF session in the sense of us not having prepared any slides or the like. We have everything with us in case you want to see something or want some examples answered based on demos or whatever. But fundamentally, it's about you raising questions to us and us having proper time to answer them here. It's basically a full hour question and answer session instead of just a few minutes you usually get at the end of a regular talk. All right, briefly on the two of us. You want to introduce yourself? This is not Josh Long, just in case you wonder.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Thomas Dachimund. I'm a member of the Spring Data team, and I work on all these Spring Data libraries that some of you might already be using. And yeah, so I'm happy to take questions on that topic. I also am an occasional committer on the Spring XD project, so if any one of you has questions in that area, feel free to ask. And yeah, with that, I give back to Juergen Hoeller.
Thanks. As you may be aware from the talks or any other source, I'm running the Spring Framework project, so that's my core domain, of course. Everything that has to do with the Spring Framework open source project as you know it. Of course, I'm as familiar as it gets with the immediate surroundings, so with the two of us, we can hopefully answer almost any question in the Spring portfolio, I would say. But the primary focus is certainly on like the core Spring offerings, framework boot and everything around it. All right, so with this said and done, let me just do a quick check. Who's been to my modern component design session today? Oh, all right. Inverse check. Who's not been to the modern component design session? All right, yeah, that's fair enough. It's perfectly all right, right? It's not a prerequisite by any means. Right, by the way, thanks for attending in such large numbers. Usually BOF sessions at other conferences are actually quite sparsely attended. Lots of people seem to go home or party or whatever. So I really appreciate that you take the time to come here. All right, so any starters for questions from you guys? Really anything. Can be as basic as it gets, or as advanced as it gets, as you want to have it.
Okay. Maybe about Sol 5. When are you going
Yeah.
to support it? Sol 5.
Solar?
Solar 5.
That's what we
Yeah, so it's I think we have a pull request about that is working on that area, and well, we haven't we haven't targeted it to a particular release date yet, but yeah, I mean the current release for the Spring Data release train is Gosling, which we are targeting for August, and I think Solar 5 support, at least as far as I know, will not yet be part of Gosling, but so the next release after that will definitely cover that as well. So that's what I can say here. Okay. Next question. Okay.
It's very objective, I mean subjective thing. Sometimes I think that the names used for classes in Spring are kind of complicated, and I have questioned if there is any plan to keep it to make it better.
So the question was, if I get it right, some of the class names in Spring, in the framework itself, are complicated, using your word, your description. And are we doing anything about this, or what's our?
German way? Or?
Yeah, it's actually the origin of the class name structure more came from Rod and Adrian. So if you want to see a national way, then it's more of a British way than anything else, British Australian way. But the class names in Spring usually have a meaning, right? They have, if they are longer or more complicated, it's usually for a reason. completely agree that they are not exactly concise. And our approach in more recent years is that they are not exposed to, say, the typical user-implemented component that much anyway. So we're trying to avoid direct references to Spring classes, or in particular to the implementation classes in most cases. So the longer winded names are primarily to be found in the implementation, not in the interfaces, I would argue, right? So if you're talking about, say, the longest winded I can think of, a local container entity manager factory bean, right? You're going to refer to that once in your JPA setup, or any other complicated ones that you can think of.
Well, yeah, there are several, of course, but
Oh, there are tons of them.
the thing is that these long classes belong, as Juergen already explained, mostly to infrastructure components, which you shouldn't have to deal with, for instance, if you're nowadays using Spring Boot, right? Because then they are mostly focused on your own domain logic, on your own classes, and all the necessary infrastructure plumbing that you had to do yourself before Spring Boot is now provided for you. So actually, that shouldn't be that much of an issue anymore once you, somehow adopt boot more and more. That's basically the thing I want to say.
If there is some common class that you find yourselves repeatedly referring to in your own code, and you find the syntax, the class name, the factory method name too long-winded, raise it as an improvement request with us. If it's about specific cases, we can't really do anything about, you know, the general average length of class names in the Spring code base. But if you have a specific case, please report it, right? If it's, say, referred to more than once in your own code base. I mean, there's plenty of reasons why the names are the way they are, so, but I don't really want to spend too much time on it. There's even a couple of favorite ones, like the base classes abstract singleton proxy factory bean. I mean, which is sometimes to be found on Twitter because it's just such a funny name. But even that one, has a completely sensible reason why it's named the way it is, right? Factory beans is a well-known concept in Spring. A proxy factory bean creates a proxy, and a singleton proxy factory bean creates a singleton scope proxy, and it's an abstract base class. I mean, what the heck? It's properly named, right? No, sometimes I wonder myself whether our expressiveness in the class names really pays off in the end. But we're trying to be somewhat clear in the differentiation between different concepts, and in particular in class hierarchies, and that's why most of those names come from. In class hierarchies, you start building from a common base class, a more specialized base class, to the concrete class, and we generally get more explicit in the name further down the hierarchy, right? So we don't really simplify names at the end of a hierarchy. We are as expressive as it gets at the end of a hierarchy. So that's why local container entity manager factory bean is named the way it is, right? A factory bean creating a JPA entity manager factory, and there's a local version, a regular local version, there's the container version of it. And so it's hard to shorten. The moment that you start shortening those kinds of implementation class names, you lose something basically. The class doesn't differentiate itself as clearly anymore. Anyway, I hope that little discussion was a bit helpful at least. But that's why we're trying to do the best that we can about annotation types, for example. So if you look at Spring's annotations, they are usually named with a different kind of attitude, a different design style behind them, right? They're named for readability. They're usually pretty short, at lazy, at auto-wired. Even the @enable annotations are reasonably short, sometimes shorter as they should be from an expressiveness perspective. @enable caching, and we could have named them @enable Spring-driven interception caching or whatever, right? With the annotation names, we're usually opting for brevity. With the implementation class names, we're opting for expressiveness of what the class actually does. That's our current recipe. All right. So the question was, what do we think about compile time dependency injection, right? The way Dagger does it, is that sort of the Dagger project coming out of Well, more or less out of Google, from the Google Square angle, where Juice also comes from. It's a fine concept, right? It's primarily driven by Android and the kind of efficient use of CPU resources in constrained devices. But even for like server-side systems in the microservices world, you could imagine that the compile time wiring actually is a fine trade-off, right? It's a trade-off in the end. You choose to kind of have some sort of loose coupling in the code base, but you hard code the actual wiring at compilation time. So on startup, you get exactly what you compiled there. Whereas the dynamic containers, such as Spring or CDI variants, they all do the wiring on startup. There's kind of a way in between that nobody does right now, which is like storing a sort of index of the common resolution results, which is primarily for like clustered environments where the same deployment unit is being bootstrapped multiple times, or the Google App Engine style deployment where the same deployment unit is starting up and stopped and starting up again and stopped depending on runtime load. So in particular for such scenarios, efficient wiring is pretty important and startup time is important. So yep, I mean, from my perspective, it's a kind of simplified version of dependency injection. There are many things you can only properly do taking the full runtime context into account. It's a bit like with the Java compiler and the virtual machine, right? The compiler itself can only make a few assumptions on compilation, whereas the virtual machine knows much more about the runtime context and can optimize inline and so forth much more aggressively on startup, knowing the runtime context that it's in. It's a little bit like that with the dynamic auto-wiring. So in order to preserve the full, say, power and flexibility of the Spring deployment model, unfortunately, we have to do startup time resolution. If there is enough demand for it, we would be willing to do the kind of index-based solution where we're trying to store kind of the previous result, and if the configuration remains the same, we're going to reuse it. So we're certainly open to doing variants of it if there's a good enough use case. But other than that, I mean, what the Dagger guys do in terms of their more minimalistic approach is perfectly fine, and we currently interact with them for JSR 330 version 2. Since the JSR 330 revision has exactly those stakeholders, Spring, CDI, Juice, and Dagger. Those are basically the current JSR 330 implementations. And what you find in the javax.inject package is the stuff that we all can agree on. In particular, Dagger is an interesting kind of limit to what we can do there, because with this static compilation time injection approach, quite a few things are simply not possible or don't make sense. And in JSR 330, in the javax.inject package, we are only going to have the things that do make sense for compile time dependency injection as well. So from a specification perspective, that package is going to be designed in a way where its concepts are applicable to both the hour scenario, the startup time injection scenario, and the compile time injection scenario, which I personally find an interesting challenge. It kind of keeps us fresh in terms of what we are discussing for JSR 330. Between CDI and Spring, it would be more like all talking about the same kind of model, but with Dagger, it's kind of an interesting, different perspective that we are listening to there. All right. Let's start here. I'm going to remember it.
I'd like to know what is behind the lazy instantiation. Maybe it's only about performance, or there is a problem that's going to be solved by this feature.
So the question was lazy instantiation, or a kind of lazy creation of a bean, lazy resolution of a bean. Is there a specific problem behind it, or is it just about performance? It's to some degree, it is about performance. It's about a trade-off between startup time performance and on-request performance, right? So by saying you mark certain parts of your system as lazy, you're saving some startup time, but usually the first request coming in, actually needing that functionality, then has to suffer through the creation of the underlying infrastructure. This may be one reason. There are scenarios where it's necessary for different reasons. I mean, this whole lazy resolution business can also be used to express circular references, for example, where if you're trying to do constructor injection with non-lazy references, like A needs B and B needs A in a constructor, both insist on getting the pre-initialized instance, you have an obvious problem, right? One of them cannot have the fully initialized requirement satisfied. By marking one of them at least as lazy, you're kind of cutting through that circle, right? You're saying like, okay, this one here doesn't insist on an already initialized object, so problem solved, right? So sometimes it's a semantic problem where the lazy resolution is an important semantic declaration that allows us to reason about the overall dependency injection graph in a system. To me, that's the more important part. The kind of saving startup is kind of a bonus to some degree. But in some scenarios, people also use lazy to demarcate parts of the system that might not be used at all. You know, if you have like a product installation where in some scenarios it's installed on servers or devices where some parts are not even ever touched or meant to be touched, maybe not even activated according to the license, and then lazy is kind of an easy way out to not even care about those parts if the chances of them not getting touched at all is high at runtime. So that's basically it, right? It's not more than that. Lazy is not a particularly fancy feature. It's just a way of expressing exactly what it's meant to express. All right.
I've just been thinking really how to best take advantage of the fact that we have you guys here right now. And, and I've been thinking what troubles me personally with Spring, with my everyday usage of Spring. And the thought is that basically most of the time I'm really quite happy, and actually I can definitely see your efforts to, for example, improve the documentation, which is much better now than a couple of years ago. I thought about one thing, that there are, well, of course, some mechanisms which kind of require a level of magic to happen, right? You put some annotation somewhere, and suddenly something is supposed to happen behind the scenes, and if you don't do something else, like you misconfigured something, it will just not work. And I find that this is the type of problem that most often happens to me, that I put some annotation somewhere and just expect something to work, but it doesn't. Then I Google up on Stack Overflow or on the forum, and hey, what else have I misconfigured? And here I just wanted to ask if you have any sort of plans to, I don't know, for example, create something that would help with this, perhaps analyze the code base statically to look for some common misconfigurations, or something along these lines.
Yeah, I might add that I found that your examples in the Spring.io are often, well, not on time, right? They're often outdated.
You mean these getting started guides?
Yeah.
In particular. Okay.
Yeah, so I guess hope most of you understood this, but I'm quickly going to recap it. So the question is about the typical misconfigurations. If you start using some feature and something else is missing because you didn't set it up and it's necessary for that part, and you can't so easily figure it out, right? You have to Google for it, and then somebody says, like on Stack Overflow, I ran into this and I found out what I had to do. Can we kind of be a little bit more actively supporting such scenarios where in some way we are finding out about misconfiguration?
Yeah. So if you wanna. Yeah, I can take this on for a second. But the thing is, sometimes it's hard to guess what you wanted to do, right? So I can see that there are certain areas where we could improve some kind of configuration diagnostics that we could perform on startup of the container, just to see whether the runtime is configured properly. And okay, we are component scanning. We saw that a certain mechanism is activated via an annotation, but we couldn't find a particular, let's say, infrastructure bean that is required for that. I mean, in some situations it already would blow up at startup, but yeah, I think it's difficult to do. But if you have some suggestions in what particular area we should improve the configuration diagnostics here, feel free to just file the appropriate Jira issues, and then we can take a look at it, because that's the way it usually works, right? Because I mean, we are on Stack Overflow, we monitor the posts, we look for typical problems that the users have, and we try to cope with that in such a way that either we write these guides, the getting started guides, that gives you guys some examples on how you usually do things, or we have dedicated example repositories on GitHub where we try to keep it up to date with the latest and greatest features that we have in the libraries. But yeah, besides that, it's all depending on you giving us feedback in a way that we can focusedly work on like that, right? So maybe if you have particular ideas, come to our booth later, and then we can discuss it, and then we can see how far we can go, right? Okay.
Thank you. Basically, my thought would be just that this approach of blowing up fast is usually the best solution, because other things like documentation and examples, they will just eventually become outdated.
Yeah, to me, it's the blowing up fast part. To me, that's the main thing we can do in the framework, is kind of, well, blow up fast and throw a meaningful exception, right? To basically give you a hint on what's missing. We are trying to do that, but it's not always easy to anticipate. I mean, there are many, in a complex system, there are many ways of failing. We don't always anticipate the paths towards failure. So if you run into a situation where you just get a very non-descriptive illegal state exception or whatever else, and you feel that there should be a clearer message given from the runtime framework, then that would be something that we certainly can improve in the framework itself. If it's more about scanning the overall code base in the sense of, oh, you're using this and you're using that, in order for this to work, you probably need to activate something else here or there. This is not really something the runtime framework does, because the runtime framework itself is so decomposed that each part only really knows about its own mission, right? So it's kind of, the runtime framework in no place has the overall knowledge of giving you any kind of hints. That said, the tooling in IntelliJ IDEA and in the Eclipse-based Spring tool suite does have that overall knowledge, right? In fact, the tooling, both in IntelliJ IDEA and in Eclipse, is already much smarter than the runtime framework is in terms of understanding the overall configuration arrangement. It knows what the components results are, it parses the configuration files, it knows about, for example, references to beans by name that don't even exist. It can make assumptions because it knows the entire source code project, right? Something the runtime framework doesn't even know about in that form. So to me, the primary channel for improvements are the IDEs, and we have a very good working relationship with JetBrains. I'm not sure whether you're aware of that, but we are closely interacting with them. We do workshop sessions with them, exchanging just their status of what they're working on for IntelliJ IDEA 15, us giving feedback on what they could improve in the Spring support. At JetBrains, there is a significant number of people exclusively working on IntelliJ's Spring support. So from that perspective, any concrete suggestions on where the at least an IDE could give some guidance, we could feed it back to not only our Eclipse team but also to the JetBrains guys at doing IntelliJ, and they do some of those things already. They have like conditions where warnings appear. You start using some kind of annotation and it says like, there is usually you have to activate this for that to work out, or in the dependency injection space, they also give you hints. They don't necessarily force you to do things there, but they're trying to guide you in a direction. So I think that's the biggest potential for improvements is actually to be found there. The runtime framework is somewhat limited. Yeah. in what it can do. And like source code scans, you know, a separate tool like a build time tasker. So it's not the same as an IDE. An IDE can do it as you're writing it, right, on the fly. It's the best possible opportunity. And we spend a lot of time on tooling, right? It's our interaction with the JetBrains guys is primarily because we consider this a very important part of the story. A modern day application framework without dedicated fine tooling isn't really worth that much, right? I mean, it's nice if you can work without tooling. I do it myself all the time, right? Working with it without any specific support. It's kind of one mission that we're behind with boot in particular. You know, you're doing this from the command line with the simplest possible editor. You shouldn't need tooling, but there's no doubt that modern day IDEs and everything that they can do can represent a very significant value in practical development. So even if we are sometimes in the demos doing this ourselves, you know, the simple editor, boot app in a tweet kind of thing, right? I mean, it's nice, but in practice, I mean, please do use the tooling that's available out there. Both the Eclipse tooling and in particular IntelliJ tooling are really worth using.
Spring has some cool small projects that can be a solution for your problem, like state machine or connectors, and you can learn about those from the Spring BOF. But if you try to find them on Spring website, they're just not there. And if you want to check what Spring offers, you have to look at the GitHub at several accounts like Spring Cloud, and so on. So is there any single place that you can find the whole Spring portfolio, so you can check if you are not reinventing the wheel?
So
to some degree. An important, I can hand it over just in a moment, but an important differentiation is between the official parts of the Spring.io platform. For those, you would just have to go to the Spring.io website, click on projects, and basically everything you see there is kind of part of the canonical set of projects that's in the Spring.io platform. That's not a complete list of projects, right? That's the projects that fall under the Spring.io platform umbrella, where the platform provides dependency management for it, and it's also the basis for our commercial support offerings. There are quite a few newer projects that I agree, that can only be found on GitHub at the moment because they are just new and not part of the platform offering yet. I suppose they will get there in some form at some point, but as long as they are not represented on the projects.spring.io website, they have to be considered kind of R&D efforts at the moment that are just not in the same support level that the platform projects are. But I'll hand it over for
yeah, so that actually there's not that much to add. We had the discussion internally as well. So whether we can find a place at Spring.io somewhere, the projects for placing this miscellaneous stuff there. But we haven't decided on how to proceed with that yet. So maybe, but as a suggestion, what you could do, of course, is just raise that on Stack Overflow and start a Stack Overflow wiki or something like that, and just list all the projects that you see, and then we can see, based on the discussion that's going on around that, then, well, whether it's worth the effort and to highlight those particular projects on a dedicated page. But then at least you have a place where you can, let's say, start the discussions and see a list of all the projects. And the project I see there is, for instance, the state machine you mentioned, or the Spring Retry library. Does anyone know the Spring Retry library? Okay, interesting. Who of you has implemented some kind of retry mechanism that somehow retries things several times or waits a timeout and so forth? Yourself? With aspects and so forth? Great. Yeah, and, okay, then you should definitely try out the Spring Retry library. Maybe it does the same thing as you do right now, and maybe some other things in addition to on top of that. So yeah, so maybe we really need a list of all the other infrastructure projects that we have. Okay, that's basically it.
But I should just add that we are not constraining this, right? Many of our engineers do start those projects. Spring Session got started that way. State Machine falls into the category. There are quite a few that our engineers start as they see a need for it, or as they get reports for their mainline projects that justify the creation of a new project. We're not constraining this. So basically, our engineers can start new projects pretty easily. but making it part of the canonical platform offering is kind of a different step to take, because that means long-time support, that means a commitment to dependency management for it as well. So that's why there's kind of a barrier. It's really between kind of the more open source R&D projects versus the commercially supported ones. The situation is unfortunate at the moment. We should have a dedicated project overview page that's not bound by the platform, right? Not constrained by what's in the platform. So point taken. We can definitely improve on that. But for initial guidance, I mean, just check projects.spring.io. Everything that's up there is kind of part of the canonical offering.
The question is also somehow related to Spring.io and documentation. Because I had to fall back from Spring BOF to vanilla Spring because of my company's policy about application servers, which is Glassfish, unfortunately. And there are known problems with Glassfish and Spring BOF. Don't get me wrong, I don't blame you for Glassfish bugs related to not necessarily annotations coming like that. But when I got back to this vanilla Spring, it was sometimes really hard to find documentation how to do something in vanilla Spring because quite much of documentation relates to Spring Boot now.
So just to quickly recap it, it's about if you're not using boot, but you're still trying to use dependency management in some form, or just figuring out how to do things without boot these days. It's kind of two flavors, right? Indeed, a lot of the examples and the guides that we do are using boot these days. I mean, it's not necessarily suggesting that they have to be used with boot that way, right? I mean, in most cases, it's about simplified bootstrapping, where the actual example shown is part of the regular Spring component model. But you have to figure out a little bit of the configuration yourself, and in terms of the dependency management, finding the appropriate versions of projects it's not always that obvious. I mean, from my perspective, I see our platform offering and the dependency information in those POMs are kind of a guideline. Even if you're not officially using them, you can kind of sneak into those POMs and look which versions we currently suggest in the latest edition, because they are very well tested in that combination. The other approach that usually works outside of boot in particular is just taking the latest versions of the open source projects involved. Because from a core Spring Framework perspective, we always track the latest of our third-party dependencies. So it's a very rare occurrence that the latest versions don't work together. Boot has a couple of further constraints because some of the things it does, some of the things that it relies on make more specific assumptions about the runtime. So I do see the problem that it may make sense to kind of take a step back from boot and do Spring Framework more the traditional way in certain application server scenarios. With Glassfish in particular, we are aware of some of those. Some of those are literally Glassfish bugs that we can't do anything about. Special workarounds from our side for known spec compliance bugs in EE servers are always a tough call. We are trying the best that we can from our side to provide workarounds, but sometimes it just doesn't make sense. With boot, boot is a little more aggressive anyway in some of its basic requirements, but even with boot, we find that quite a lot of people do use it in established environments. I mean, we've even had requests for Servlet 2.5 compatibility in boot, which we initially didn't target. So to some degree, we even have special measures in boot, like the Spring Boot Legacy add-on that provides Servlet 2.5 compatibility. If we can do this in a reasonable way, we are trying to provide some extra support for it. But even the Spring Boot Legacy is outside of the supported platform portfolio, right? So because in the I/O platform offering, it's all Java 7 Plus and Servlet 3.0 Plus.
May I add something? With respect to moving from boot back to a plain Spring Framework approach, well, if you know Lombok, there's a project called dlombok, which does something similar, which removes all the Lombok annotations and generates the plain Java code that you would have to write. I think so. We have not planned something like that for boot, and I don't think that will ever come, but at least what you can do, of course, is since, as Juergen already mentioned, Spring Boot relies heavily on automatic configuration by sensing the environment which it's running in. There are these auto configuration reports available which show you which classes Spring Boot considers and which class it actually loaded to see which beans it should create and define, right? And in general, all these star autoconfig classes or auto configuration classes are actually the defining the Java bean definitions, the Spring Bean definitions that you need to write. So basically, if you just look at those classes and just copy the bean definitions in your regular Java config, then it should just work, right? And you find all those auto configuration class for a wide range of different technologies. Though Spring Boot has, as Juergen also mentioned, a different approach with regard to which technologies it uses or it supports, or by default. For instance, it has an opinionated approach, for instance, for using, okay, if you want to use JPA, we automatically provide you with a configuration for Hibernate, right? If you want to use something different, like Eclipse Link or OpenJPA, you have to create the infrastructure beans yourself. But anyway, if you start with this Hibernate configuration in that case, for instance, you can, basically just take that and change the implementation class as you want, and then you are done so far. So that's basically the way it works by hand. So.
It was already mentioned, why do you use Lombok in a framework or library like projects?
So,
what's the question? Sorry.
Why do you use Lombok in the library or framework like projects?
While we are not using Lombok?
No.
Oh, while we are. Why are we using Lombok?
Yeah,
are we
well,
using Lombok?
Yes, the thing, okay, you mentioned it yesterday or so to me that I think one of the Spring Cloud projects, was it Spring Cloud?
At least in a few of those.
Okay, they are using Lombok to automatically generate all the boilerplate getters and so forth. Well, in my point of view, I think it should actually not be in the framework in there. So we should even if we would use Lombok in the source, we should de-Lombok it when we generate the source for the final compilation step and so forth, that you see the plain Java stuff. But that's just my opinion. Well, but I took a note of that, and we'll have a talk with the other guys, with my colleagues, and see whether we can change something there. I mean, it shouldn't be. I mean, the changes shouldn't be too much involved to get rid of Lombok in that case. But yeah, that's something that we can discuss with the team, and then we will see. But I think it's not by, let's say, not official idea. So.
I wasn't even aware of it. So. The core projects don't do this, right? But many of our projects have independent project leads with very specific mindset in terms of how they want to do it. So that decision is up to the corresponding project leads in the end. We can raise it with them, of course, if there's a specific reasoning behind it.
To follow up, at least for me, Spring Framework was the thing that set some standards. It was, if you looked at the source code, it was how you should do things, so what are the best practices, and stuff like that. And recently, some new projects were released in the 1.00 GE release. And if you look at the source code, it's not bad, but if you compare it to the standards that Spring Framework has set, they are way below those standards. And I totally understand that shipping the 1.0 release is crucial just to know if you are going the right direction, and for me it's justified. But are you planning to focus on the quality of the source code in the following releases so that the community doesn't catch those patterns that are now used in those new projects?
So the question is, I mean, Spring Framework as a role model for like the source code structure and source code quality, and some of the newer Spring Portfolio projects are not quite being up to those standards in terms of their source code style yet. I mean, point taken, and I'm sure you're right, since some of those projects have been released with a much more, well, aggressive time-to-market strategy behind them. it's, I mean, in the end, internally, we do use the Spring Framework style, the implementation style as a guideline for all the projects. But in terms of making compromises, a project lead may decide that it's more important to release it as a 1.0 GA. Personally, I would love, for all of our offerings, even these side projects, to be up to those standards, and they should be. But well, we can only really push our project leads a little, right? That they are focused, that they are spending dedicated time on improving the source code quality in some cases.
Pragmatic approach, or the
Yeah.
lean way to ship the MVE or something like that. But are you planning to focus on those things in the upcoming releases of those projects? So
I would hope so. Yeah.
2.0 is really up to the standards.
Yeah, I would hope so. I mean, it's point taken. Glad that you raise it, right, from an outside perspective, even since internally it's harder to argue. But we can raise it with the wider team, right, and kind of saying that this is the feedback that we got. I think the ones affected know who they are, right? Sort of if we raise it internally, I think people are aware of where they're at. Like in the boot project, for example, Phil Webb in particular spends a lot of time in kind of fine-tuning and crafting the internal structure of boot. He keeps improving the internals, right? So the areas that I'm involved with directly, in particular boot and data, I think are of quite high standards. Yeah, so I would hope that it is, because we really spend significant time there. But yes, some of even the corners of boot, right? There might be gray corners where it's not up to the standards yet. That may be the case, but at least the Spring Boot core is, I think, of almost the same quality in terms of the effort that we spend, at least, right? I mean, it's all about software, and it's written by people, right? By humans. So it's sort of, it's never going to be perfect, but we generally strive for a degree of perfection, at least, right? If something's not there yet, it should be there in a further revision. So I'm definitely with you in that it should go there. Like personally, I'm almost obsessed with those things, right? So I'm kind of forcing myself not to insist that everybody else has to be as obsessed with it. But in general, I mean, we are talking about long-term infrastructure projects. The code that we put out there, even in some of the not as popular or as central projects that we do, even the code there is going to be long-lived. It's going to be around for many years. So it needs to be in a shape where it's properly maintainable. Even just for that reason, it needs to be up to certain quality standards. We're not doing ourselves a favor if something kind of is in a gray state of things. We have to maintain it, after all. Or somebody else may have to maintain it, right? If the project lead changes and creates a new project. We do that all the time. We generally have very stable team arrangements, but some of our project leads move on to create other projects, right? Like Dave Tsai is a good example, having started Spring Boot, now running Spring Cloud, and Boot having been taken over by Phil. So even there, you have to maintain somebody else's code, and it needs to be in a good shape for that to be possible. Yeah, sorry, there were questions over here that I didn't. Yeah.
Do you plan somehow more actively develop the project for Android? Because so far what I noticed is that they support only 2 features,
Yeah.
both for REST and authentication. Any plans?
Yeah, point taken. So the question is, do we want to invest into Android more, like a Spring for Android offering, more than just the 2 features that there are in there right now? I'm afraid it's kind of a niche offering from our perspective, right? Our expertise is on the server side primarily, and on server-side systems. We are not necessarily experts in mobile development, or nor do we want to be experts in that space. We are more trying to interact with the common, experts there. Right? We're trying to do things the way that the experts in that space want those things to look like. So we're not going to develop an Android-based app framework or anything like that, right? We're just providing connecting pieces, I would say. And I don't think that strategy is about to change, right? That's probably, we have to make our picks, right? We have to focus on something. And neither do we focus on iOS, right? This is not about iOS versus Android. It's just about our ability to provide something on Android because we can reuse some of our code, right? It's more or less Java. And so if there's low-hanging fruit there, we're certainly willing to pick it and provide it. But in terms of a larger investment, I don't see that happening at this point. We'd rather support somebody else doing it, right? If there are other stakeholders in the Android space saying, we want to develop an Android-based framework arrangement that works nicely with Spring or stylistically matches with Spring, we would definitely support them, but we don't have the resources to do it ourselves.
Next question maybe here.
Hello.
Oh, sorry.
How do you address performance? Do you have any clients using like very fast bidding systems? Anyone said that maybe I prefer to run my own servlet by myself, not use Spring Boot for that?
Well, I can maybe answer that. Well, for instance, one project that currently drives a lot of performance improvements is, for instance, Spring XD, our big data platform, so to speak, where we, for instance, recently improved the performance with the Kafka integration, which basically went into the Spring integration projects, which lead to significant improvements there. And yeah, it's basically about like you said, we have customer projects that run our stuff, and if they see that, okay, we don't get the performance that we were expecting, here are the hotspots, please help us solve those, and yeah, that's the way we get feedback and we work on that. Another example is this Spring expression, the spell expression compilation support, right, which is now available since Spring 4.1, which also came out of requirement that was set by Spring XD to be able to quickly easily specify all kinds of arbitrary small expressions that should be evaluated very quickly, right? And yeah, that's basically what led the N.D. Clement, one of the authors of the AspectJ compiler, to actually sit down and write a spell expression compiler, right? Which dynamically generates the Java code that you would otherwise have to write out of a spell expression. So yeah, it really is that's the way it works. We get feedback from projects that some stuff is not fast enough, and yeah, then we will make sure we'll try to make it faster. And yeah, that's what we did on various occasions already.
Do you do any load testing for your code?
Yeah, we have. Yeah, for some projects we have dedicated benchmark projects that we regularly run, sometimes even in the continuous integration environments where we make the project build fail if a certain performance threshold is not met, or let's say in this way. And of course the other way is that client projects, which we are really deeply intensive work with, give us immediate feedback because they try out all the latest versions that we have, and we will immediately see, okay, this is not fast enough, please help us. That's the way it works. Okay.
What is your strategy on bugs raised by the community on the issues? Because, well, I witnessed that some simple cases, like in one of the classes there was some string hard-coded, right? And there was a pull request made that just take that string into some setter, and it waited on your action for some few years actually, and the community and the comments on Jira or on Stack Overflow, we just created some going runabouts on it.
Which issue was that? We're talking about an issue.
Spring Security was.
Oh, Spring Security. Oh. Yeah, because the question is, how do we handle issues or pull requests coming from the community?
Checks that issues, or just so low profile that
No, it has nothing to do with low profile. It's more of the attention that the project lead, in particular, gives to the issue tracker. I would argue that with Spring Framework, we are very actively tracking all the issues. Low-hanging fruit like this, straight changes that make sense just when you look at them for 5 minutes. We are rolling them in immediately most of the time. We had a certain phase in Spring Framework's history where some issues, due to team changes and other reasons, started, were hanging around a bit, not getting proper attention for a while. We did several passes through our backlog, trying to find them, trying to mass comment on them, that whether people still care. And as of the Spring Framework 4.0 timeline, we are like very actively on a day-to-day basis tracking incoming issues for the Spring Framework project. Spring Security had a handover as well, right? So in Spring Security, there are not as many people on it. Usually it's basically driven by a single person. And there was a handover phase there where the issue tracker certainly didn't get as much attention as it should have. So sorry for that happening. It's not the norm, right? That simple issues, simple pull requests hang around that nobody pays attention to them. It certainly doesn't happen in Spring Framework for years anymore. And with other projects, now it's, if you know about a case, raise it with me. I'm going to kick the corresponding project leads. Yeah. So, but it's those things really should happen. In particular, that's the way we usually handle this. Is more about the impact of the issue, right? A non-trivial change, something that influences the overall arrangement. In a non-trivial way, we may have a harder time rolling this in immediately. But simple changes like making something configurable that wasn't configurable before, with no impact on the regular default code path, we are, from a Spring Framework perspective, we roll this into maintenance releases, right? If you want to see this in Spring Framework 4.1.7, we would just roll it in. If you tell us 2 days ahead of the release, we would roll it in then. So we don't have an artificial waiting time or anything. We're very agile in incorporating recent issues from that perspective. So it's more about the impact, I would say. And if it doesn't work that way in some of the projects, we need to improve that. But with Spring Framework and Boot in particular, we are very community driven. Lots of the things that we are doing are driven by Jira community issues. We look at the votes there, at the comments there, so anything that has recent comments on it, that has a decent number of votes on it, is going to get extra attention. I mean, bear with us that some of the things are not easy to implement, as easy to implement as they look like maybe initially, but the things that are easy to implement, we roll them in immediately. That's the reason why we do those point releases with like 50 tickets addressed. If you look at our issue tracker and the history, you can look at this very easily, right? Just go into the releases and check how many bugs are being fixed in each release and how many improvements we roll in. There's always a decent number of improvements, even in the maintenance releases. Sure.
Aren't you afraid of the Spring Boot that it will devour other Spring projects? Because it's so dead simple to use that finally it may end that there will be Spring Boot only, because Spring I/O platform will be part of it, because no one else will know how to configure it except for starter projects.
So the point is, are we afraid of Spring Boot, to use your words? Because Boot might be the only thing that people use to configure a Spring-based project? Well, if that's an outcome to be afraid of, I mean, we're generally fine, right? If people use Boot as an entry point, all the power to them. There's nothing wrong with that. From my perspective. But to add some numbers here, according to a recent survey, 25% of the Spring 4 user base uses Boot as well at the moment, which is for a young project that Boot still is, right? It's in terms of a GA release, it's not even 1.5 years old yet. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, since Spring Boot basically takes Spring Framework and provides a like sweeter, to some degree more aggressive configuration experience, right? More assumption-driven configuration experience. It doesn't really change anything that Spring Framework does. It just puts it into a nice little Well, wrap, right? Where to me, that's if Spring Boot becomes as popular as you're suggesting, there's nothing wrong with that.
But you know, there are dark sides. For example, pre-configured conventional configuration.
Yeah, you mean the opinionated part, the input?
And it means that perhaps there will be a time when no one will know how to configure other than default.
Yeah. So kind of.
It is the reason why we created the Spring.
Yeah, may I paraphrase this? People start forgetting how to configure these things without boot, so at some point, nobody knows how to configure those things individually. I don't see that happening right now. I mean, we have a large user base with Spring Framework who's kind of perfectly happy. Yeah, yeah. Let's check again next year and see what the adoption rates are. But I mean, from my perspective, it can easily go up to a 50%. I'm not entirely sure it can go beyond that, though. There's a large corporate enterprise user base out there for Spring Framework. That's they are kind of very driven by explicitness. They wanna like explicitly configure what they get. And part of the traditional Spring Framework configuration promise is exactly that there's no hidden configuration. You configure what you get, right? You set up the thread pools, you set up the entity manager factories, you set it up and the application uses it, right? We're not kind of magically configuring it. So from that perspective, it's an explicit choice whether somebody opts into the boot auto configuration model or rather prefers the explicitness of the Spring Framework configuration model, the traditional model. So it's an estimate, of course. Nobody knows, right? But my estimate is that the threshold is going to be around 50% from my present day perspective. There may be 50% of the Spring user base boot, but I don't think it's going to grow beyond that.
50% will be legacy of Spring, yes? Because the enterprise is Spring 2, Spring 3, and they will simply stop.
The 25% were among the Spring 4 user base. But that's what we're looking at, right? Point taken, the traditional corporations are not going to switch to boot because they have existing Spring 2 or 3 based apps. That may be the case, but I'm primarily interested in the Spring 4 adoption rates. And in the Spring 4 generation, there's still a large audience choosing not to use boot. Arguably, it's primarily the audiences who have been using Spring before and kind of are not switching yet, but there are new projects started where boot doesn't play a role. We're going to see how it turns out. But from an investment perspective on our end, we're definitely keep investing into both stories. Spring Framework has a completely independent development line. The plan does not take into account that boot is going to rule the world, right? From a Spring Framework perspective, we assume that basically that everybody uses Spring Framework traditionally, and there's also boot as a stakeholder. Boot needs to have the opportunity to do things the best possible way with its model. So boot is a stakeholder of the Spring Framework configuration model, not the stakeholder, right? Not the only one, not the primary one. So we fine-tune stuff in the Spring Framework configuration model that has nothing to do with boot still, right? And we don't intend to change that. Even as of Spring Framework 5, Spring Framework 5 is going to have an independent configuration story of its own, independently developed and fine-tuned, with boot as a key stakeholder, of course, right? We are doing a lot of things primarily for boot to be able to build on it. That's true, certainly. But it's by no means an exclusive right to bend things towards the boot way at all. So from my perspective, point taken, but I don't think we're going to get into that extreme situation. Personally. We're going to see where we're at in a year or two. Oh. Do we have more than this? We're basically almost out of time. But I mean, if you want to keep sitting for a few minutes, I'm perfectly fine with that. So your question was about generally about who do we consider our competitors? Good question. Comes a little late in this game, though, since we could spend a lot of time talking about this. But I'm trying to provide you just a brief perspective. We are generally not very competitor-driven, for a start. We are driven by our own design vision and by the needs that we see in the community. So we are not primarily orienting ourselves around competitors. many of the things that we've done recently, in particular Spring XD, for example, also the Spring Data projects, are actually pretty innovative efforts on our end, right? That have no immediate competitors. I'm not aware of, I mean, you could, with XD, you could argue that there's stuff that happens in the Hadoop space, but that's not how XD arrived. XD basically grew from experience with Spring integration and our Hadoop team, and kind of, it has a very independently minded origin. That in the end, you're always competing with somebody in the market, it's clear, right? But not necessarily at the very same level. More of a, you're in the same space, right? You're not really doing the things the same way. So often it's just this kind of very superficial competitor role. I mean, if you want to add something on that.
Yeah, maybe for Spring Boot, for instance. I mean, it's what I personally see, not as a competitor, but on a player in the same game, so to speak, is, for instance, Drop Wizard. The stuff, but you can clearly see from our history that there's a clear interaction between the people from Spring Boot and Drop Wizard. We have components from Drop Wizard, the metric stuff, for instance, integrated in Spring Boot, but we also had some pull requests sent to Drop Wizard to improve their code base from our teams. For instance, I did some pull requests there, and so it's clearer. There's clear some kind of exchange between all those different players in the market, so to speak. But it's more. I wouldn't see it as competition. It's more like you have choice, and it's about driving innovation by adopting what works best for the community and for others and so forth. So that's basically it.
It's a lot of it is about influences, right? Certainly there's cross-pollination in this industry. Everybody influences everybody else, right? That's clear. But so that's the one end. From another perspective, more a market perspective, we compete with other large players in the market, right? Spring has a very significant market share in the Java space, and the wider Spring ecosystem anyway. And obviously there are other players with large market shares. So from that perspective, that's who we're competing with, I suppose, right? Just the market rules at work. There is often this perceived competition with the J2EE space, which from our perspective, my perspective, isn't a real competition, right? It's more the situation where some players in the EE space are trying to compete with us than us trying to compete with them. Because Spring is just a very natural fit with many EE environments. We know what our user base and our customer base in particular is doing, and there's a very significant use, present day 2015 use, of the modern day Spring versions on EE, in EE ecosystems, on EE servers. This keeps being an important part of our world, right, of our first class citizen world. So from that perspective, it doesn't really qualify as a competition. If you want to do a more specific competition between like the Spring DI parts and CDI, yeah, obviously that's competing in terms of the problem that it's trying to solve and with the slightly different design style. In all fairness, right, that's kind of a competition, but beyond that, if I'm twisting the question again, right, towards who do we see as our competitors in the sense of who would we like to compete with, right? So it's we're of course tracking quite a few other projects, right? What they're doing, where they're going, but we're more inspired and driven by, say, like the some of the niche players that don't actually have that large of a market share, but they have interesting stuff that they're doing, right? This is a strong inspiration for us. And it's from a market share perspective, this might not matter now, but we expect it to matter in a few years' time. The big data space wasn't, like just a few years back, wasn't a big space at all. We started investing into it pretty early, the whole NoSQL offering, right? Databases beyond the relational world. We started investing in this pretty early. Were we trying to compete with anyone there? I'm not sure. To some degree, we always are, but that's what we're inspired by. We always take more of a 3-year horizon into the future, and the interesting variant of the question to me is, who do we want to compete with in 2 or 3 years? That's a question that we raise to ourselves, because it helps us well, it inspires our vision, right? It helps us in planning ourselves for the time frame, what we want to achieve in the time frame, for the time frame. And at this point, the whole reactive programming space is really interesting to us, right? The strong inspiration is what the all of the reactive programming R&D results are at this point. With everybody from the Netflixes of this world to our own Reactor project to what TypeSafe does with Acker and that's all a strong inspiration to us. To some degree, a kind of competition, but I mean, with Netflix, we have such a close relationship with eating each other's dog foods. I mean, those guys use Spring Cloud, and we use Hystrix and RX Java, and what else? I mean, we're not really competing, right? We're on in the same boat. TypeSafe, you could argue TypeSafe is a kind of competition. They have Play, they have Acker, they're trying to fish in the same pond. I don't know. It's sort of TypeSafe has a very unique way of doing its things. It's certainly a degree of inspiration. We have reasonably good relationships with them as well, but we don't really. The technical solutions don't really interact that much. Spring doesn't have a strong standing in the Scala world, and the Acker actor model is very kind of. It's almost siloed to some degree. Play has its own way of doing things, doesn't really interact with some of our technologies that easily either. Is that a competition? Maybe. But you see, my point is basically we're not really that immediately driven by competition. We're in a large industry here with like 12 million plus Java developers, and there's a lot of place in this industry, place for lots of players. We would be in a sad state if there was no competition at all, right? If there was just one way of doing things for 12 million developers, I mean, come on, right? There needs to be some alternatives here. So personally, I really appreciate the TypeSafes of this world, what Netflix does, what comes out of Google, right? More of the kind of R&D efforts, even if they just have a niche in the market, but I really appreciate the impact that they have, the impact on us and the impact on the wider industry. I do think that we need it, right? We need this this mix of attitudes and this more enterprise-minded and the more startup and smaller scale microservice-minded efforts. And our role in this industry is to kind of bring together a few of those development trends. We're trying to adopt those trends and to make them ready for the mainstream. That's our understanding of what we're doing, right? We are in the business of providing mainstream solutions in the end. We're trying to anticipate what's going to be mainstream in a few years or what has a mainstream impact in a few years and trying to invest in the right directions there. So that's basically just a little bit of a brain dump. Even maybe not the most concise, immediate answer to your question, but I hope it helps to understand our reasoning. All right, well, we're 5 or 6 minutes beyond. If you have any remaining questions, I mean, feel free to ask them up front, but I would say let's wrap it up here from the general session, right? So thanks for coming. Thanks for staying. Enjoy the rest of the show.